Jesus is pretty clear in today's gospel, isn't he? Love your enemies. I can just sit down now, right? Amen? And they are so hard. Someone said to me as I was walking into the 7:30 service, it seems harder today than it was yesterday. It only seems to be getting harder and harder. I'm not sure if that's actually true. It's just been hard in different ways for different people, right? This passage has been so misrepresented and abused even, is that sometimes we as Christians think that when something terrible is happening, we can't respond to it because we don't know how to respond in love. We want to be nice, right? We don't want to disrupt the pattern just to be cruel or mean back, right? Well, Jesus is saying, he's calling us into a space where we're not doormats either. The space where we're not a mirror for hate and oppression, but rather a window of grace, a canvas for mercy, a reflection of God's love that calls for transformation, not only of our hearts, but those who may not be aligned with us and that love. That's really hard to do. And when I was trying to think of a time in our history when that has happened, where somebody was being oppressed and a group in love and nonviolence came together and did a counteraction, can you think of one or two that's happened in our history? What comes to mind? Yes, the civil rights movement, right? That's immediately what came to my mind. You see, I grew up in North Carolina. I grew up in a town just 20 miles from Greensboro. Anybody know the significance of the Greensboro Woolworths? If you don't, this was the spark that ignited a firestorm of the civil rights movement. But I grew up down the street from a Woolworths. How many of you have ever been in a Woolworths while they were still open? Now, if you don't know what a Woolworths is or never been in one, they're a little bit like a teeny tiny Target. A mix between, maybe, right? So it's a little bit like a general store and a department store mushed into one. And what made it special was that in the back of the Woolworths, there was a lunch counter too. And you could get a sandwich and a milkshake at the lunch counter. When I grew up, Woolworths was a space to buy cheap candy. And so all of my friends and we would gather as many quarters, dollars we could gather from babysitting gigs, whatever odd jobs we would do, in between the cushions. You know, I'd pull all these coins everywhere. And we would pool our money, ride our bikes to Woolworths, and spend the whole amount on candy. I'm sure my mother was super pleased about this now that I recount this story. But I remember this counter in my memory. And as I grew up to be a teacher, I was a fourth grade teacher for a little bit in North Carolina, where you really learn state history. Now, side note, I know nothing about California state history, but I know everything about North Carolina state history. And I learned about this Woolworths counter, just the very same replica of the one that I remember as a kid. It was in the museum in downtown Raleigh, this replica of this counter, because of this moment. On February 1st, in 1960, 4 African-American students weren't connected together, they were just friends, and they wanted to do an act of courage. They weren't trained in nonviolence. They didn't know what would happen. They walked into the Woolworths. They bought a comb, gum, whatever the Woolworths was selling at the moment, and then went to the counter, the lunch counter, and at the lunch counter there was this invisible line that they only served whites at the lunch counter. They served everybody at the regular counter, but the lunch counter was for whites only. And they sat down. And the clerk is like, I think you mean to be in the takeout line, right? And they show their receipts and say, you served me here, why not here? And the whole store didn't know what to do. They just kind of stood there. They called the police. The police didn't know what to do. Eventually, after hours, they just closed the store because they didn't know what to do. In the midst of this, a white woman walks up to them and says to one of the gentlemen, I'm so disappointed in you. And preparing for the rebuke that they clearly knew would come in their minds, they prepared for that, but instead, she put her hand on his shoulder and said, I don't know what took you so long, and sat down and joined them. What she intended, I think, was this was the moment she was waiting for too. And that she was so incredibly grateful to be part of this movement, to be part of this moment. This moment in Woolworths in 1960 on February 1st was an act of courage and love. And because the whole community didn't know what to do, they didn't know what to do because they knew it was wrong and shameful. And that brought hope to lots of students everywhere. And before you know it, they were holding a protest every single day at that lunch counter and other lunch counters and places all over the South. It ignited the firestorm of the civil rights movement when the movement went really fast. In our local Woolworths, that happened. That is what Jesus means when Jesus says to love your enemies. To love them in a way where you show where there is wrong. Jesus said, they tell you an eye for an eye, but I don't mean that. I don't want you to mirror that cruelty. This incredible theologian, my favorite theologian, Walter Winks, says it's Jesus' third way, the way of nonviolence. That when Jesus says to turn your cheek, he says in today's gospel, if anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. If anyone takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. These little moments, if you were to think about the history and time, this is what Walter Wink points out, of the error, they're moments of shaming the act of itself, the oppression. For example, let's talk about the coats. How many coats did people wear back then? Anybody know? You had your outer coat and you had your inner coat, your inner shirt. Was there anything else? Maybe sandals, right? No, nothing else. There was this little bit in Deuteronomy that if you were poor and you couldn't pay anything, you could pay your coat. And there was a law around it that if you were to have to pay your coat, that the person receiving the coat had to return the coat at night so that you wouldn't die in the cold weather. But in the morning, that person can come back and say, okay, I'm back, I'm ready for that coat. And that would return over and over again until the debt was paid. Now, imagine this. If you were to ask for your coat and you turn around and you give everything you're wearing, you're standing there naked. The shame in that type of culture is not on the person being naked, but the person seeing the nakedness. That if you're ever in a debted situation where you have to give your coat, something is wrong with the system. Turning the other cheek. If you were to turn your other cheek, the best way that someone would discipline someone who's a slave is they use their backhand. And that means if you use your backhand, there's only one cheek that you could get hit. If you turn your other cheek, there's no other way to hit them except to treat them as an equal and hit them like you would an equal. Both of these things are about pointing out the oppression as a way of love. Loving your enemies in such a way that you are transformed in that love, and so are they. Thurman said, "A man faced with nonviolence is forced to deal with themselves, to make the man face his own action or inaction." Walter Wink was a part of the civil rights movement, and he marched in Selma. And he wrote in a book about a moment where Reverend James Bevel was talking in the crowd to the sheriff of the time, Jim Clark. Jim Clark was very oppressive. That's the nicest way I could put Jim Clark at the time. And they said, "It's not enough to defeat Jim Clark. Do you hear me, Jim? Do you hear me? We want you converted. We want you to see people the way we see people. We want you to love the way that God has taught us to love everyone as equals." Jesus is talking about the courageous love where justice is not vengeance, but transformation. He removes the idea of retribution. We do it not to love because we expect love and back, but rather to be in that space of grace and mercy, to be that transformable space. Thank you, I'm good. Well, actually, I appreciate it. So kind, noticing that I was breaking up there. Now, in this day and age, is that an overwhelming ask? What do you think? Yeah. It feels that way, doesn't it? It feels that way. But we can't wait. We can't be like the woman who just waited for that moment. The 4 men didn't wait. Jesus didn't wait. Are we waiting? And what are we waiting for? You see, the moment doesn't have to be massive or grand. It can even be at your local Woolworths, right? It starts in our own community and spreads out. Jesus tells us today that love is not a weakness, but it is our strongest resistance to evil, to oppression, and calls us to a love that disrupts, reveals, and transforms. May we have that courage to resist evil, to love in a way that doesn't mirror just the hate, to be a window of grace and a canvas of God's love. Amen.